Hello and welcome to the Nutritank podcast, where we interview leading experts within the field of food systems, nutrition, and lifestyle medicine. Our aim is to empower you, the next generation of healthcare professionals and change makers. We believe that the valuable knowledge and experience of our guests will inspire you to act and join the movement in creating a healthier population. What if there was a nutrient associated with a lower risk of heart disease, type 2 diabetes, stroke, obesity, and bowel cancer, while also supporting gut health and overall well-being? Wouldn't our governments be funding billions in promoting it? Yet around 9 in 10 adults still don't consume enough of this nutrient. That nutrient is indeed fibre. And despite the overwhelming evidence supporting its benefits, most people still fall well short of the recommended daily intake in the UK, North America, and Australia. My name's Iain, and I'm the co-founder of Nutritank. And today we're joined by Priya Tew, an award-winning registered dietitian with an expertise in eating disorders, IBS, and sustainable dietary change. Priya is a member of the British Dietetic Association and has worked extensively across both the NHS and private practice, helping individuals navigate nutrition with a practical, evidence-based approach. She is also a familiar face in the media, having appeared on BBC News, Sky News, and BBC One's Eat Well for Less, and is the author of books on the DASH diet for hypertension and low FODMAP diets for IBS. One of the reasons I've always enjoyed working with Priya is her ability to meet people where they are. In a world increasingly driven by nutrition headlines, fear, and food rules, Priya champions a more compassionate approach, one that focuses on the whole person and the positive changes we can make into our daily lives rather than what we should be taking away and the negatives. In today's episode, we explore why fibre is one of the most overlooked nutrients in the health media landscape and discuss the latest FiberMaxing trend. We discuss the role of fibre in gut health, inflammation, and overall well-being, the common barriers patients face when trying to increase their intake, and practical, realistic dietary swaps that healthcare professionals like you can use to support behaviour change in clinical practice. We're excited to share Priya's insights and expertise with you today, with support from our podcast sponsor, Linwood's Health Foods. Hello and welcome, Priya Tew, to this episode of the Nutritank podcast. And we're delighted to have you here today. And we are going to be talking all about the topic of fibre. And I know that this is something you talk about a lot on social media. It's really important topic to us within public health, and I think it's really important that we spend a good amount of time today on this podcast really delving into fibre and how important it is. So let's go to sort of social media and this new trend which is kicking up. So leading us into this FiberMaxing, it's a big trend at the moment on social media. It's got almost like 5,000% increase in search of fibre. People are really looking at this and thinking, okay, what's this all about? So what is FiberMaxing?
So FiberMaxing has been this big trend about basically trying to max out your fibre, trying to meet your fibre recommendations, trying to get as much fibre as you can into lots of different meals and into snacks. And I absolutely love that fibre is having its moment, because I think honestly, years ago, I remember as a dietitian and as a group of dietitians, us talking about why is it every single big nutrient has had its moment, but not fibre? Fibre is just the least sexy of all the nutrients. So it's really, really great news that fibre is something that's being talked about. And I'm absolutely here for that. But I think we've got to be cautious of people also not almost making fibre the next big thing and life becoming all about fibre. And then we're forgetting about actually a balanced diet is what we're meant to be talking about, not just fibre by itself. So I'm kind of pro and con with the whole FiberMaxing move.
So fibre, are we having enough of it in the UK or globally? What's the issue with that?
The short answer is no. Most of us don't get enough fibre. So the UK recommendation is 30 grams per day for adults, which I
Mhm.
think largely doesn't make much sense to many people until you really start looking at nutrition labels and diving into how much fibre is in what foods. And that recommendation comes from the Scientific Advisory Committee on Nutrition, so SACN. And right now, what we know from the research that's being done and on the dietary studies in the UK, we're sitting around 18 to 20 grams. Now, that is better than it used to be. Because when I read that, I was like, oh, we have increased our fibre intake. Like, we are doing better, but we have this consistent gap in fibre intake. And we know that only around 9% of UK adults are actually meeting that 30 gram target. So that's quite staggering, I think, when you think about it from that perspective. Children actually are slightly worse, we find, for fibre. So we perhaps need to be encouraging children a little bit more with their fibre intake. And I think what it's really helpful to think about is, what does this gap mean? So if we've got maybe this 10 gram gap, what does that look like in terms of actual food?
Mhm.
Because it sounds quite a lot. It sounds like it could be an enormous quantity to add in, but it's roughly what you would get from making a few swaps. So, for example, switching from your white bread to your whole grain bread, or adding a portion of lentils to dinner. And when sometimes we phrase it in that way, people go, oh, actually, that's something that I feel like I could do on some days. I feel like I could make a few swaps. And that's really what our messaging all needs to be about fibre, is it's not as complicated as you think. And it's about making simple swaps.
Yeah, that's a brilliant way of putting it, those simple swaps. And I thought that that was a question I was going to ask you later on in this episode, but why don't we talk about that now? Do you want to give us, as clinicians, as healthcare professionals, some other great examples of what we could provide our clients or patients in a really short consultation? What examples could we give them that could be really beneficial to them?
Always start with where somebody is. So taking a diet history of them, thinking about their socioeconomic status and thinking about their lifestyle and their needs. Because sometimes as clinicians, we go in all guns blazing and say,
Mhm.
make all these swaps. And then actually people go, but that's not accessible for me. I can't actually do that on a day-to-day basis. So, we've always got to remember with nutrition recommendations to meet the person where they are. But some things that you might want to think about is whether somebody can switch, as I said already, from white bread to a whole grain, a seeded, even a best of both, kind of a mix. Even if they're adding in some wholemeal flour when they're doing some baking, so we don't have to go completely wholemeal, whole grain, but doing a mix. If we've got someone like me who likes to bake, we like to add in a mix of flours when we're doing this. Other simple ones, if we think about breakfast, switching your cereal from something like cornflakes or Rice Krispies to something that's more like Weetabix, for example, or oats, we know are a really, really great source of fibre. And then we've got the classics of switching from things like white rice or white pasta to the brown or the wholemeal version, if you like it. Now, we've also got to think there's lots of different varieties out there now on the market. So we've got things like lentil pasta and pea pasta. We've got things like bulgur wheats. We've got lots of different grains. So one of the things that I encourage people to do is to actually just add in diversity. So, okay, maybe you don't like brown rice. Let's add in some different whole grains then. Let's think quite widely and broadly about this, because that's the real key. And then one of my favorites is, how can we encourage people to put more beans and pulses in their life? This can be tricky. If you're someone who's never cooked with lentils, then you might have no idea what to do with a tin of lentils. But encouraging people to just start adding them in, adding some chickpeas into a stir fry, putting some lentils into a casserole when you're doing it, putting it into your salads and into your lunches. I think that can really help, because we know that those have got a lot of fibre in them. And then I think a very last one I might say is encouraging people to have things like more like nuts and seeds in their diet. So when we're snacking, okay, maybe you don't want to just have nuts as a snack. I get that. I don't like to just have nuts as a snack, but how can we incorporate those by sprinkling them on top of our yogurt, or by having some in your breakfast cereal? And when we start to just increase the fibre and look at the diversity of foods, it is going to start making a difference.
When you say it like that, when you describe all those foods, it just sounds so appealing and delicious and tasty. It's all about the positive changes, isn't it? Rather
Yeah.
than the negative, removing. What do you think about that?
Absolutely. It's all about adding in. And let's not forget things like fruits and vegetables have also got fiber in them. So, a simple message is, can you add in a portion of fruit and veg? Can you add in some nuts or a sprinkle of seeds to your meal? Absolutely. We're encouraging people to add in, and we're trying to take away from this negativity they might have about having to restrict and cut out and have a diet that they don't actually enjoy.
Really the importance of the whole diet and about balance, and rather than just focusing on one thing. And I think that just brings us to that point, in social media and a lot of the echo chambers going around about misinformation. Sometimes there's priorities just on protein and carnivore diets. And why do you think these trends occur? Why do you think people are so against fiber or carbohydrates as a benefit? What is going on there?
We like to take it in turn to go from one diet to the next and to jump on one nutrient after the other. Everybody's looking for the sexy way to eat. They don't want the balanced, healthy eating. And this is one of my bugbears as a dietitian, right? How on earth do I make balanced eating exciting? Because generally that's just not how it's seen. I think a lot of these diets, like the carnivore diet, they come about because somebody has a benefit and then they share their story, and then people start jumping on the bandwagon with it. So largely it's anecdotal evidence that we haven't got a good solid research base for. And a lot of the time when you look at these diets, they are taking something to an extreme. And I think that's why it does so well on social media, because we know on social media, anything that is taken to an extreme is actually going to be amplified, which is again why, people like me who are sharing, eat your vegetables, eat more fiber, we're not getting amplified very much because it's not an extreme message. So I think that's some of the problem with this messaging. And then we've also, quite often we find that the people who are sharing these messages, the influencers that are jumping on these, again, they're quite extreme with the advice that they're giving anyway. So it's a really complicated thing for the public to navigate. I think it's something that we as healthcare professionals have to come at with a lot of compassion. And so I quite often explain to people, do you know what? I have to look these trends up myself because I don't always know what they are. And I have to go back and check them out. So no wonder it's confusing for anybody else as well.
Even healthcare professionals, as you just said, can get confused by the latest trends that go on. And we get questions all the time. And I get questions from colleagues, what about this trend or what about that trend? But it really is coming back to the basics. Before we get back to the episode, a quick reminder that Nutritank membership costs just £5 a month, about the price of a coffee. Members get access to over 100 CPD accredited nutrition and lifestyle medicine courses, certificates for their portfolio, and a community of medical doctors, students, and healthcare professionals passionate about improving patient care through nutrition and lifestyle medicine. Join today and help bring nutrition into mainstream healthcare.
Part of the bigger question here is, why are we always looking for the new thing? We always want the next best thing, the new shiny object. That's what we always want to chase. And the long and short of it is, we have got so much evidence on things like a Mediterranean style of eating that show us that actually that is the bee's knees. That is the way to be doing it. But whenever something new and shiny comes along, we all kind of go, oh, well, maybe all this wealth of evidence is wrong. And maybe this one new thing is going to be the miracle cure, which means I don't have to put all the legwork in. So I think healthy, balanced eating, eating more fiber, it requires work. And it requires effort and it requires time and preparation. And that is hard when people are running a busy lifestyle. And I think that's one of the biggest barriers I come across.
Let's talk about that. Let's just say I have someone in the consultation room, audience has someone in the consultation room, they say, what should I try and eat to help my health or benefit my health? What are the most common barriers and how can we help our patients overcome those barriers?
There can be so many barriers, but some of the ones to maybe think about is accessibility. So actually, what access do people have to shops? Because we can get ourselves caught in our own little bubble that everybody's like us. And actually, that's not always the case, I find. I find some of my patients have absolutely no access. They're limited to a little local shop. They don't drive, or they have to go on a bus and then they have to carry everything back. And other people are having a weekly shop from Waitrose. So it can be very, very different. We've also got to think about people's beliefs around food. I think that's a really, really key one, and their culture. Again, we can just assume that everybody eats in a certain way. So really getting to know, asking people questions like, what are the foods that you really enjoy? What are the foods that you as a family tend to have? And then another really big barrier that can sometimes be surprising is the lack of cooking skills. And a lot of people are not actually brought up knowing how to cook. So I've certainly had people say to me, but I don't actually know how to peel a carrot. And I found that quite surprising in the moment, but I've come to realize that it is quite common, that people actually don't know how to prepare vegetables. So if you say add more vegetables in, what does that look like? What do I do with a pepper? How do I roast it to make it delicious? So I think those can be some of the key barriers, and obviously money as well. So trying to keep things as practical and simple as possible. And I tend to find that people really want examples. So rather than saying add more fiber in, they want those examples of, okay, well, how about you try adding a couple of spoonfuls of lentils in when you're making your soup? And then when you blend it up, you're going to have more fiber in there. Or how about when you're going out on your school run, you grab a banana and you use that as a way to get an extra portion of fruit in your diet. So real practical examples, getting to know somebody's background can be so super helpful.
What is it, fiber and increasing of fruit and veg? What are the health benefits, like the known benefits? What is the evidence behind fiber for health?
So I think we've got so many different impacts that fiber can have on the body. So we know that, for example, there can be an impact on cholesterol levels. So things like beta-glucans that are found in oats, they can definitely have this beneficial impact on reducing cholesterol levels, which can potentially help with cardiovascular disease. We have got a known benefit on blood sugars. So some of the soluble fibers can very much help with a reduction in blood sugars, and fiber can just help keep our blood sugars more stable, is the way I describe it. We stay more stable for longer. Satiety is another really big one, and this can be quite a sales pitch for people when you say, actually, if you eat more fiber, you're going to potentially stay fuller for longer, and therefore you might not want to snack on as many things later on in the day. And then we've got the massive, massive impact on gut health. So we know that some of these fibers are fermented in the intestines, and that can actually be so great for feeding our gut bacteria. Plus, they are going to produce things like short chain fatty acids that have beneficial effects as well. And I think a lot of people now are talking about gut health. This has become a known term. So, saying actually fiber is good for your gut health. That phrase alone can sometimes really help people go, oh yeah, in that case, I'll try this. And then we've also got the evidence for bowel health, that actually insoluble fiber can accelerate transit time and can help with removal of toxins from the body as well. So if we think about the big diseases and potentially the impact, we've definitely got some benefits in terms of type 2 diabetes risk and cardiovascular disease risk. And then we've got these huge benefits on gut health as well. So I think globally, it's a really good thing to be focusing in on.
How quickly would people see benefits of increasing their fiber, let's just say for their gut health?
So I think, firstly, I'll just come back on you there.
Yeah.
Absolutely, it's good for us to be increasing it, but we don't want to go too far.
Okay.
And I think that's one of the worries I have, is that people were just going to put more and more and more and more and more fiber in their diet, because actually you can have too much fiber. And for some people, that's going to cause digestive issues all on its own.
What kind of digestive issues?
So bloating, abdominal pain, most definitely are something that we see in people, excess wind, all those kinds of IBS style symptoms are things that people can see when they increase their fiber too quickly. So when we're talking about increasing fiber with people, it's encouraging them to make these increases, but to make them over time. We might recommend that in the first couple of weeks, let's switch from white to wholemeal bread a couple of times. Let's change this a couple of times. We don't want them to go all in with fiber, because they're probably going to feel quite rubbish and then go, well, that didn't help my health whatsoever. I feel terrible. Now, in terms of how long it's going to take for you to see benefits, well, actually, the research suggests that that can happen in just a couple of weeks. So if we're thinking about how quickly are we going to see a change, well, the actual changes in our gut health and our gut bacteria can happen quite quickly. But something like better transit time is going to take a few weeks, 2 to 4 weeks. And it's also worth knowing that these changes are quite fragile and will reverse. So if you were to make these changes for a couple of weeks and then stop, then largely, again, we're going to see that revert.
Some amazing benefits there. Just to be really clear, better transit time, less likely to get constipation, better poops, essentially.
Absolutely.
This episode of the Nutritank podcast is proudly sponsored by Linwoods, who are passionate about helping people support their health through simple, nutritious, everyday foods. Linwoods produce a range of milled seeds, nuts, and nutritious food products that make it easier to increase key nutrients such as fiber, omega-3, and plant-based protein as part of a balanced diet. As healthcare professionals, we know that small, sustainable dietary changes can make a big difference to long-term health. And increasing fiber intake is one area where many people across the UK are still falling short. You can learn more about Linwoods and their range of products by visiting their website or following them on social media. Now, let's get back to the episode. Do we know mechanistically why fiber improves gut health, why it has good benefits to our gut microbiome? What's going on there in a bit more detail?
Let's have a think about what we've got going on. So when fiber arrives in the colon, it encounters all of those trillion microbial cells that we've got going on down there, and the bacteria will ferment the undigested carbohydrate. So that fiber becomes a food source for our gut bugs. I've heard this described by somebody as I've got pets living in my colon and I'm feeding my pets. And I think that's a lovely analogy and a lovely way sometimes of explaining to people, because bacteria can sound a bit, oh, I don't want bacteria in my body. Now, what's the impact of this? Well, we get byproducts from this fermentation process. And some of those are short chain fatty acids. Known, if we think about the names of those, we've got butyrate, we've got propionate, and we've got acetate, as well as gases. Now, those gases are why people get bloating. Okay, so if we're increasing our fiber quickly, we might get more of those gases, we get more bloating, and it can also be why some people suffer with bloating full stop, which is why fiber changes can help people with IBS style symptoms. So a lot of the health benefits we can get originate with these short chain fatty acids, which I think is kind of quite magical. We give ourselves fiber, the gut bugs eat them, they're producing these short chain fatty acids, and then we're getting these benefits. If we think about what some of those benefits are, we can have strong anti-inflammatory effects that come from butyrate. We can actually get an influence on appetite and mood, because we've got 90% of serotonin being produced in the gut. So I think these short chain fatty acids are actually something that we need to be looking into more, and we need to be doing more research on. But we know that they're really important signaling bodies with effects that go way, way, way beyond the gut. They can actually reinforce the tight junctions between our gut cells, so they can help us maintain a healthy gut bacteria, and that's really important. Propionate can actually play a role in suppressing cholesterol synthesis, which again is a really important one. And acetate actually has quite a wide reach. It can cross the blood-brain barrier, and as I said, it appears to influence appetite through an effect on the hypothalamus. So I think it's knowing that actually these little changes in fibre can have quite a far-reaching impact on the body.
You've said a number of times there different types of fibre. Just for our audience, I know a lot of them will know this already, but for those who are new to this or just a revision of the nomenclature, so soluble and insoluble, could you just give the definitions for them and why those two are different and what they do to our bodies?
If you want an even deeper dive into this, it's a good thing to go away and have a look at because we actually have more types of fibre than soluble and insoluble. And actually, soluble and insoluble, we're using for patients, but in terms of the deeper evidence, we know that something that's soluble can be fast, it can be slow, we can have different types of impacts, but we'll stick with the soluble insoluble because I think that's the term that we tend to use the most. Here's where a simple analogy might be helpful because I like to think a bit pictorially in my brain. If we think about soluble fibre as being a sponge, it dissolves in water, it forms a viscous gel, and it slows down gastric emptying. So actually that means that it's going to slow down blood sugar increases, and it actually traps bile acids. It forces the liver to pull LDL cholesterol from the bloodstream. It's this form of fibre that soaks things up and it traps them, and then it helps pull them through. Okay, now soluble fibre is really helpful because it can actually make our stools more well formed. And that can be helpful. So if you've got somebody who is quite loose in their stools, for example, then soluble fibre can be really helpful there. Insoluble fibre is the broom that sweeps this out. It doesn't dissolve. It's hard to break down. It adds bulk to the stool and it helps speed up transit time. So we're thinking things like whole grain cereals, skins on your fruit and vegetables, nuts and seeds. So if you've got somebody who is eating too much insoluble fibre, maybe all bran, lots of kind of high, what we might generally traditionally call high fibre foods, they can actually feel quite bunged up and constipated because that fibre is there and it's meant to be pushing through, but it hasn't got enough of the soft, spongy stuff with it. So that's why we need then a balance of the soluble fibre in order to get that lovely balance. So we've got our formed stool that can pass through the system. And that's where sometimes people talk about you should reduce your fibre, you should increase your fibre. Well, yes, okay, that's okay to say, but we need to be a lot more specific with it, like what type of fibre and what foods is that found in. And that's where, as a dietitian, I like to get quite deep into the fibre conversation with patients.
What other fibres are there other than soluble, insoluble?
So the soluble and insoluble can be broken down into other categories, which I think largely we just call 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. They're not particularly called different names, but if we think about other types of fibre, there is resistant starch as well. And that's something that isn't talked about that much. I have seen it coming up on social media actually recently. So resistant starch is found in cooked, cooled and reheated carbohydrates. So if you were to cook your jacket potato and then reheat it, for example, you've got resistant starch. I think focusing on the soluble and the insoluble is really helpful when you're talking on a patient basis, but it's knowing that actually there are some other types as well. And we basically want a balance of everything.
What are some great examples that we could give to clients' patients that are soluble and insoluble fibres? Easy for them to on their day-to-day.
Soluble fibres, one of my favourites is oats. I'm a huge oats fan. And then also legumes, so lentils, chickpeas, kidney beans, baked beans, all of your beans, apples and pears, citrus fruit, chia seeds. You think about how they swell lovely when you add them into liquid, for example. Coming up more and more for what I'm seeing, so a good one to mention is psyllium husk, which is something you can buy off Amazon as a supplement, and some people are using this as an addition into their diet. Personally, I would always go for a food first approach rather than telling one to take a supplement, but there can be some great clinical applications with using this one. So always stick to the food first. A great way to suggest people increase their soluble fibre, for example, would be, well, why don't you switch from whatever you're having for breakfast to your oats? We can add in some chia seeds or some linseeds, make sure we've got plenty of fluid in when we cook it, and we've got lots of great soluble fibre to start the day off there. So that would be a really good application. And then if we add in an apple as a snack, you're going to be getting more in your day. With insoluble fibre, again, this is the hard stuff. This is our wheat bran, our whole grain. So whole grain bread, your brown bread, your cereals, your brown rice and pasta, the skins of fruit and vegetables. Those are probably more our classically thought of high fibre foods. They tend to be the insoluble ones.
This would be a great time to plug the update to the dietitian-led clinical practice on constipation and eating 2 kiwis or 3 kiwis a day with their skin on, and as well as maybe psyllium husk. What else was there on the guideline?
Magnesium. I think it's magnesium citrates on there as well.
Is that supplement or is that a tablet?
That is a supplement, yeah. But I think the kiwi is a really great one. And I've definitely seen clinically with people when I've made some swaps from their breakfast. So I've swapped their breakfast cereal that may have been a really high fibre one to something that is more soluble fibre, like their oats, for example. And then when we've added the kiwi fruit in as well, it can really make a difference. So the kiwi is quite magical, but also quite simple to do. Once you get past the skin part, sometimes that's a little bit of a barrier. People do get used to it. I think if it's giving you the benefit, then, people will do it.
I've recently got through the barrier of the skin, and I'm taking the barrier as part of the diet now.
We should say that that's for constipation, right?
As a fast snack at work without having to remove the skin. It's good to know that it's beneficial and no harm caused. So throughout our conversation, you have mentioned a number of times foods, cereals, breads, other products, which are processed foods. Now, there will be listeners who have a question. Okay, we've heard a lot on the media at the moment about ultra-processed foods. You've used these products within this healthy and evidence-based dietary pattern. Could you give our listeners a bit more sort of nuance around what products we can be eating safely and what we can be providing our patients and clients with really good evidence, basically?
The ultra-processed food discourse has become exceedingly scaremongering. And I think it's really important as clinicians that we don't go down that path as well. Because if you actually look at the research, what we see is some ultra-processed foods do have a negative impact on health. They're the ones we would expect, in all honesty. We would expect that if you're eating an awful lot of, confectionery and crisps and donuts and snack foods, that's not going to be great for you long term. Now, when we look at other ultra-processed foods, such as wholemeal bread and plant milks and things like baked beans, for example, even breakfast cereals, largely a whole grain, if we're looking at whole grain cereals, actually, they don't have that impact. So specifically, some of the research I remember reading not so long ago was actually saying that wholemeal bread and dark bread, so things like rye bread, for example, and fruit-based snacks and some of the dairy products, which can be considered ultra-processed, actually had a positive impact on health. But that messaging wasn't picked up by the media. The only messaging that's been shared is all UPFs are bad for us. So the important thing to talk about with patients is actually we need a better grouping of ultra-processed foods. And if we just apply, personally, I think, nutrition common sense to this, it makes perfect sense that if we eat an overly processed diet, it's not going to be good for us. But if you are using some shop-bought stuffed pasta for a quick meal, you're adding in some frozen vegetables and you're stirring some pesto through, it's not a bad meal, but there's ultra-processed foods in it. So it's not about everything ultra processed being bad. My mantra on this has been from the start, try to reduce but don't restrict. So think about actually, where is it you've got a lot of ultra processed foods? Is there a swap you can make? But we don't want to think about having to cut everything that's ultra processed out of our diet, because that can be really inaccessible for a lot of people. So as an example from my life, in our household, we were using shop bought snacks to go in the children's lunch boxes, like malt loaf cereal bars, those kinds of things, quick and easy. And I decided that we would start baking all of the snacks for the packed lunches. Now I have 6 children, so 6 times 5, it's quite a lot of snacks that have to be available in a week. But every weekend I bake with one of the children, and it's become a really simple thing to do. It's teaching them a life skill as well. And actually the children are preferring it, because it's led to conversations at school where other people are going, oh, what's that you've got in your lunchbox? I quite often put vegetables in when I'm baking. So it'd be like, oh, this is a carrot and chocolate chip muffin, or, whatever it might be that week. So it's a simple swap, but that has had an impact daily, because every single day there's a reduction in one ultra processed food in their diet. And if we can see it as actually, how can I make one swap and do it daily, that is going to have an impact. And then you might be able to go, right, okay, now I'm going to make sure that an extra day of the week, I'm cooking from scratch at home and using less ultra processed foods. But I don't think we want to scaremonger people on this. That's the key message here. And again, it comes back to fibre. How can we make simple swaps rather than overcomplicating and giving people the big messages and scaring them?
Personally, I like to think of things like Weetabix in the morning, even healthier, nutritious things on top of it, because otherwise it's hard to eat, like seeds and fruit and nuts. That would be maybe a bit bland or hard to eat on their own, and then you add in more nutritious things. So when we're talking about increasing fibre, what do we need to talk about in terms of hydration? How important is that when we're advising our patients to increase their fibre?
Well, insoluble fibre absorbs water. So without adequate fluid intake, it can actually worsen or cause constipation rather than helping it, which is where, again, we want this balance of fibre, but we also want fibre and fluid to be talked about. So if you're having something high in fibre with a meal or a snack, the best thing to do is make sure you're also having a drink. Nice and simple. I'm having fibre. Most people will have a drink when they're having something to eat anyway, but some people will experience this worsening on their symptoms and conclude, well, fibre made my symptoms worse. And that is accurate, but there is a reason and a simple solution as to why. And I think also we've got to be aware that sometimes people will take added fibre supplements that haven't been recommended, things like bran, for example, and that can also make symptoms worse. So hydration is really, really important, as is thinking about the balance of fibre that somebody's having.
Thank you. And you've mentioned it maybe twice or 3 times now, but supplements or fibre supplements, what do you mean when you refer to that? Because there are nuts and seeds which are ground up. What do you mean when you say fibre supplements?
So you can actually buy some fibre supplements that will, come in a pot, and you can add them into your food. So I'm talking things like that. And sometimes there can be really good benefits to these, especially if they've been prescribed or you've been talking about them with your dietitian. But sometimes these things are obviously mentioned on social media and people jump on them as, well, that's going to fix all my problems, which it might do on the one hand. But when we're just taking a supplement in isolation, we're missing out on all the other nutrients that are in that food matrix.
You're adding it into an already fibre-rich diet as an additional beneficial ingredient.
Yes, some people will.
You mentioned in flare-up of IBS symptoms. What can we advise patients who have IBS or IBS symptoms when it comes to fibre and increasing fibre?
That is a topic all in its own for a whole podcast, because IBS is pretty complex. So it's going to depend what their symptoms are. If you've got someone who is more diarrhea prone, then we might need to think about them adding in more insoluble fibre. If we've got somebody who is more constipated, they may need more hydration, they need more soluble fibre potentially. So I think we've got to go a bit deeper into what their symptoms are. And also always remembering with IBS, it's not just a nutrition-led application here. We actually need to think about the nervous system. And there's huge link there is between the brain and the gut. And whilst we've got some dietary approaches we can use to help, one of the biggest things I find when I work in IBS is how can I help someone calm their nervous system? And if I can do that, then quite often the flare-up will calm down as well.
So finally, what one resource could you give us and our listener, health professionals or members of the public listening, that could benefit them today, or they could go look up and read or watch?
That is a really hard question, you know. I would say I've written a book on IBS.
Brilliant.
So if IBS is something you're struggling with, then I've written a book called The Complete Low FODMAP Diet Plan, which takes you through stage by stage approach. And even if you don't do the low FODMAP part, it actually gives some really good advice on fibre, and it shows you the different categories and talks about the different foods. So if fibre is something that you feel you could do with focusing on, I don't want to self-plug, but it's actually a book I use myself in clinical practice because I can't keep everything in my head. And I think other places to go, have a look for the fibre guidance. So you can actually go and look at the SACN guidance, for example. And the British Dietetic Association has got some great food fact sheets. So having a look at their ones on fibre. And I know they've got one that looks at the different swaps as well. But that would be a really good place to go and look as well.
Thank you. And SACN, what does SACN stand for?
Here we go. The Scientific Advisory Committee on Nutrition.
Perfect. And one simple practical tip that our listeners could take away that they can start doing today. It can be either dietary or any other self-care that helps you or your clients.
As a dietitian, I feel it should be dietary, but it's not. So my biggest tip would be to work out what you can do to calm your overall nervous system, whether that is adding in breath work or meditation or a walk in nature or doing some crafting or playing a musical instrument. It's so important across mental health and across many physical health conditions. And I'm seeing this as being a growing problem in my clinical practice. So I think that would be my most important thing that I really think that us as busy people in a busy society need to really lock in on.
That's really perfect. Thank you. And how can our listeners find you or discover more about you? Do you have social media, website?
I have got social media, so you'll find me largely on Instagram. If you just look at Priya_Tew, you'll find me. I am on TikTok, but it's not my favourite platform. I find it a little bit overwhelming. Or you can pop to my website and I have a great range of blogs. There will be some on fibre on there as well. So my website is dietitianuk.co.uk. Feel free to message me, to connect with me, because I always love to chat.
Thanks for listening to the Nutritank podcast. A huge thank you to our guest, Priya Tew, for sharing her expertise and insights on fibre, and to our podcast sponsor, Linwood's Health Foods. If you enjoyed this conversation, please subscribe, leave a review, and share the episode with colleagues, friends, or anyone interested in the role of nutrition in healthcare. See you in the next episode.